When survival demands selfishness, sometimes the bravest choice is compassion. Alone against the cold, life at Wrangell, St. Elias. The wind screamed through the frozen wilderness, battering the old timber cabin that stood like a stubborn relic against the fury of Wrangell, St. Elias National Park. It was the kind of night that made even the mountains seem small and powerless, swallowed whole by a blizzard that erased the line between earth and sky. Inside the cabin, Daniel Brooks stirred his coffee absently, staring into the dim glow of his wood stove. At 46 years old, Daniel wore the marks of a hard-lived life, a tall, wiry man with deep-set hazel eyes, a graying beard, and the calloused hands of someone who had long since traded comfort for solitude. 5 years had passed since he'd left Los Angeles, a city he once loved, after cancer took his wife and left him hollow. Here, 40 miles from the nearest outpost, he survived by routine, chopping wood, hunting game, checking the weather radio, and remembering how to forget. Tonight, though, something gnawed at him. The storm outside was unlike any he had seen, temperatures plunging toward -45 degrees Fahrenheit, winds howling so fiercely the whole cabin moaned with every gust. Even the fire seemed powerless against the cold, its light a weak pulse in a sea of darkness. Daniel rose and crossed to the frosted window, scraping away a thin circle of ice with the cuff of his jacket. He expected to see nothing but the endless white. Instead, he caught movement, shadows, low to the ground, struggling against the wind. Frowning, he grabbed his flashlight, the heavy old military model, and angled its beam into the chaos. There, huddled against the porch, were 3 shapes. A bear, a massive one, and 2 small cubs. Daniel stiffened. Bears in February should have been deep in hibernation, not wandering half-dead through a storm. Instinct told him to bolt the door and pray they wandered off. But as the flashlight steadied, the truth sharpened into focus. The mother bear's cinnamon-colored fur was matted with ice, her powerful frame trembling with exhaustion. The cubs, smaller than they should have been, their dark brown fur dusted white by frost, clung to her side, shivering violently. One of the cubs stumbled and crumpled into the snow, barely moving. Daniel's gut twisted. He knew the rules out here, rules that had kept him alive through more than one brutal winter. Never feed wild animals. Never make yourself a target. Never invite nature inside your walls. But those rules hadn't accounted for this. Through the thick window, he locked eyes with the mother bear. There was no rage there, no wildness. Only desperation. Only surrender. He cursed under his breath and backed away from the door, pacing the cabin floor, heart pounding. Logic screamed, stay inside. Survive. But another voice, softer, but no less urgent, whispered, if you turn away, you'll never forgive yourself. The cabin had an attached equipment shed, insulated, separate, used mostly for storage. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. Maybe enough to buy the bears a chance. Daniel moved quickly. He threw 2 old wool blankets into the shed, cranked up the backup heaters, and pulled on his thickest gloves and coat. The storm was worsening, stepping outside now was risking frostbite in minutes. But the thought of those cubs dying a few feet from his door was more than he could stand. He cracked the main door open just enough to slip out. Instantly, the wind slammed into him, a solid wall of frozen air that stole his breath. The bears lay slumped against the porch rail, more snow piling over them by the second. Keeping his movements slow and non-threatening, Daniel laid a path of blankets from the porch toward the shed. His voice, low and even, barely carried over the storm. "It's okay, girl," he murmured, though he doubted she could hear him. "Come on. You're almost there." The mother bear lifted her massive head, nostrils flaring. For a moment, Daniel thought she might charge, or collapse. But then, with infinite slowness, she shifted her weight and nudged one of the cubs toward the warmth bleeding from the open shed door. The blanket helped. She gripped its edge in her teeth and dragged the cub forward, her own body swaying dangerously with exhaustion. The second cub followed, too weak to resist. Daniel retreated to the doorframe, heart hammering in his ears, ready to slam the door shut if things turned bad. But they didn't. With a final staggering effort, the mother bear hauled her cubs across the threshold of the shed. As soon as they were inside, she collapsed, wrapping her massive frame around them, hiding them from the cold. Daniel exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. He eased the shed door mostly shut, leaving it just cracked enough for air, and bolted the main cabin door behind him. Standing by the fire, peeling off his ice-crusted gloves, Daniel stared out the small window that overlooked the shed. The storm raged on, furious and wild. But inside that little room, for the first time that night, life had a chance. And in Daniel's battered, frozen heart, something stirred awake. Tomorrow would come. But tonight was about hope. The night visitors, a family in despair. The first hours after the bears entered the shed passed like a dream suspended in frost and fear. Daniel sat by the window, wrapped in every blanket he owned, his breath fogging the glass as he watched over them. The storm outside screamed against the walls, and the little cabin shuddered under each brutal gust. But inside the shed, tucked into a makeshift nest of blankets and weak heater glow, the bear family clung to life. Daniel could hardly believe what he had done. Every wilderness survival manual he had ever read, every ranger he had spoken to, would have condemned him for it. Letting wild animals so close wasn't just dangerous, it was suicidal. Yet, staring through the window into the cramped storage room, all he saw was a mother fighting to protect her young. No different, really, than what any human would do in her place. The mother bear lay curled tightly around her cubs, her great body heaving with slow, labored breaths. The cubs, barely moving when he found them, now twitched occasionally, tiny signs of life beneath their frost-crusted fur. The heaters hummed softly, their orange glow barely touching the deep blue cold pressed against the door. Daniel watched for any sign of trouble, a lunge toward the door, a flash of aggression. But none came. The bear's eyes, when they opened, showed no wildness, only a dull, exhausted awareness. She was too weak to move, too desperate to waste energy on fear or anger. He knew he couldn't leave them to fend for themselves in there without help. By the second hour, he was digging through his meager supplies, scrounging what he could spare. Half a sack of dried salmon, some stale bread, and a dented metal basin that once served as a dog's water bowl years ago. It wasn't much, but it was life. Bundled against the still roaring storm, Daniel crept to the shed door. His boots crunched softly against the packed snow, the wind clawing at his coat like angry fingers. He moved slowly, each step deliberate, careful not to startle the fragile trust that had begun to form. Setting the basin just inside the door, he filled it with water from a flask warmed inside his coat. The bears didn't move, but he saw one cub's nose twitch slightly at the scent of moisture. Daniel placed the food a few feet farther in, then backed away, never turning his back. When he reached the cabin door, he slipped inside and bolted it, heart hammering. Through the window, he watched. Minutes stretched into long, shivering waits. Then, finally, the mother bear stirred. Her massive head lifted, nostrils flaring. Slowly, groggily, she nudged one of the cubs. The little one whimpered softly, a sound barely audible even above the wind. Encouraged, the mother shifted again, awkwardly dragging herself toward the basin. Daniel's chest tightened. The bear lapped weakly at the water, each movement slow and careful. Then, sensing safety, she nosed the cubs forward. They moved like newborns, clumsy and weak, but they moved. One reached the pile of salmon and began chewing with tiny, trembling bites. Daniel felt a knot in his throat he hadn't realized was forming. He pressed his hand against the cold windowpane and whispered without meaning to, "Hang on, little ones. Just a little longer." The storm showed no mercy that night. By midnight, temperatures had dropped further, nearing -50 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. Snow piled against the cabin walls, burying the first floor almost to the windowsills. The world outside was frozen solid, locked in a battle only the hardiest would survive. But inside that fragile, makeshift shelter, life flickered stubbornly. Daniel stayed awake all night, dozing only in snatches, jolting awake at the slightest sound. Every time he peered through the frost-rimmed glass, he found the bears still huddled there, breathing, fighting, surviving. As the first hint of a grim, colorless dawn crept over the mountains, Daniel sat back in his chair, exhaustion pulling at him. He had risked everything, his home, his life, on a gamble born from instinct and compassion. For now, against the fiercest storm Alaska could summon, it looked like he had won. But deep down, Daniel knew. The real fight had only just begun. The next day dawned gray and merciless, the sun a pale smear behind thick clouds. The storm had weakened, but the cold had deepened, settling over the valley like a heavy, merciless hand. Even inside his cabin, Daniel could feel it, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that turned breath into ice crystals and made wood groan with pain. Through the frosted window, he watched the small storage shed, its roof bowed under the weight of fresh snow. No movement came from inside. A sick weight settled in Daniel's chest. Had the night been too much for them after all? He pulled on his heavy gear, triple layers, thick boots, a fur-lined hat pulled low, and prepared himself for what he might find. He didn't let himself hope too much. In Alaska, hope was a luxury you rarely could afford. He stepped out into the brittle morning, the snow crunching sharply under his boots. The short walk to the shed felt like miles. He hesitated at the door, listening. Nothing. Heart pounding, he cracked it open an inch. At first, all he saw was a mound of brown and white, unmoving, silent. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look closer. Then he saw it. A twitch of an ear. A slow rise and fall of breath. Alive. Relief broke over him so fiercely he had to steady himself against the doorframe. Inside, the mother bear stirred, blinking slowly in the dim light. The cubs were curled against her belly, warmer now, their small bodies no longer as limp. When Daniel stepped back to give them space, she didn't move to charge, didn't growl. She simply watched him, her eyes dull but aware, her massive body shielding her young as fiercely as any mother. Daniel returned with more food, bits of frozen salmon thawed over his stove, broken into manageable chunks. He placed them carefully just inside the door, then withdrew, leaving the bears to their own fragile peace. For the next 2 days, Daniel lived in a careful rhythm. Feeding the bears, warming water, checking the heaters, all while keeping a safe distance. He dared not enter the shed, nor linger too long. Trust was a slow, delicate thing, hard to build, easy to shatter. During the long nights, he sat by the window, staring through the frost at the shed. He watched the cubs slowly regain strength, stumbling around their mother, play-fighting weakly. He watched the mother bear lift her head higher each morning, her movements growing less sluggish. Each tiny victory, a cub standing upright, the mother shifting to clean her cubs, felt like a triumph against the merciless cold. Inside his cabin, Daniel found himself talking aloud sometimes, filling the silence with half-whispered encouragements neither the bears nor the wind could hear. "You're tough, girl," he muttered one night, sipping scalding coffee as the stove crackled weakly. "You're tougher than me, that's for damn sure." The days blurred together, a dance between the storm outside and the fragile recovery inside. The bears were still wild, still dangerous. Daniel never let himself forget that. But something had shifted between them. There was a moment, a small thing, but to Daniel it felt monumental, when he approached the shed with food and found the mother bear already sitting up, waiting. She didn't lunge or retreat. She simply watched him, her massive head tilted slightly, as if acknowledging his presence, not as a threat, but as something else. An ally, maybe. A necessary risk. For Daniel, it was the first time in years he had felt a connection that wasn't tinged with loss. The world outside remained deadly. The radio crackled with reports of downed trees, collapsed cabins, even deaths from exposure. But here, in this tiny corner of the frozen wilderness, something stubborn and fragile was surviving. By the morning of the third day, a strange stillness fell over the land. The storm had finally spent itself. The clouds began to break, revealing slices of pale blue sky. The temperature climbed, barely, but enough to soften the sharp edges of the cold. Daniel stood on his porch, breathing in air so clean it almost hurt, and stared at the white landscape stretching in all directions. It looked the same, harsh, endless, empty. But he knew better. Change had already begun. Back inside, he packed what little food he could spare into a battered satchel: dried meat, stale bread, a few precious chunks of salted fish. It was time. He opened the shed door wide for the first time, stepping back to give the bears a clear path. The mother bear lifted her head, nostrils flaring as fresh air flooded in. For a moment, she remained still, as if weighing her choices. Then, slowly, with a grace that belied her injuries, she rose to her full, towering height. The cubs stumbled after her, stronger now, their eyes bright despite the days of hardship. Daniel stayed back, hands loose at his sides, heart pounding in his throat. The mother bear looked at him once, a long, lingering look, before turning toward the open world beyond. Together, she and her cubs stepped into the blinding whiteness, leaving the little shed, the cabin, and the man who had saved them behind. Daniel watched them go, a lump rising in his throat he couldn't swallow. They didn't look back. They didn't need to. The bond between them had been forged not in words, not in taming or ownership, but in a moment of shared survival. And in the wild heart of Alaska, sometimes that was more than enough. Between fear and faith, a life-saving gamble. Daniel stood alone on the porch long after the mother bear and her cubs had vanished into the blinding wilderness. The snow reflected the fragile morning sun in a brilliance that almost hurt to look at. For the first time in days, the wind had fallen silent, leaving only the faint groan of distant trees settling under their icy burden. He pulled his heavy coat tighter around his frame and leaned against the railing, trying to steady the strange storm inside him. Relief. Sadness. Awe. It all tangled together, leaving him hollow and full at the same time. The bears were gone. The shed stood empty. But the bond he had formed with them, that moment when survival instincts gave way to something deeper, remained carved into his very bones. He didn't know how long he stood there, lost in the frozen landscape of thought, before the sound came again. A low rumble. At first he thought it was just the groaning of snow shifting under its own weight. But no, this was different. It came from beneath him. From the earth itself. The porch shook slightly, the vibrations traveling up through the soles of his boots. Daniel snapped to attention, every nerve firing at once. Another rumble, louder now. Followed by a sharp crack, a sound like the world itself splintering apart. He whipped his head around toward the narrow trail leading down the mountainside, the only road back toward McCarthy and civilization. And he saw it. The ridge, towering above the trail, was crumbling. Massive slabs of rock, loosened by the thaw and the storm's fury, were beginning to shear away from the cliff face. Daniel's stomach dropped. A rock slide. A big one. Without thinking, he bolted down the porch steps, sprinting across the hardened snow toward the path he had cleared the day before. His mind raced. If the rockslide reached the trail, and it would, any second now, it would bury the only way out under tons of debris. If he were caught on it, there would be no survival. Halfway to the trail, he saw movement ahead. A dark shape. At first, panic flared, another wild animal? A threat? Then realization struck like a bolt of lightning. It was her. The mother bear. She stood in the middle of the trail, blocking it completely, her body turned sideways as if to bar his passage. Daniel skidded to a halt, heart hammering, confusion warring with instinct. Why was she there? Why now? The ground trembled harder. Small stones tumbled down the slope, bouncing wildly across the snow. The roar of falling rock grew deafening. The bear turned her massive head toward him, her eyes locking onto his. There was no aggression there. No fear. Only urgency. She stamped a massive paw into the snow, sending a spray of powder into the air. A warning. An order. Daniel hesitated only a second longer before he understood. She was not threatening him. She was stopping him. Saving him. With a strangled cry, he turned on his heel and sprinted back toward the cabin, his legs pumping with raw survival instinct. Behind him, with a sound like a god tearing the world apart, the cliff face gave way entirely. Tons of rock, dirt, and broken trees thundered down onto the trail where he would have been standing seconds ago. The air filled with the deafening crash of impact, the ground bucking beneath him as if trying to throw him down. Daniel stumbled onto the porch and whirled around. Through the rising cloud of dust and snow, he caught one last glimpse of her, the cinnamon-furred bear, standing proud and still at the tree line, her cubs huddled close behind her. Their eyes met one final time. Then she turned and melted back into the forest without a sound. Daniel slumped against the cabin wall, gasping for breath, the shock of what had just happened crashing over him harder than the storm ever had. She had saved him. The bear he had risked everything for, had risked everything for him in return. Daniel stayed slumped against the cabin wall for a long time, the world spinning slowly around him. The roaring of the rockslide still echoed off the mountains, a haunting aftersound that seemed to stretch endlessly across the valley. Snowflakes swirled lazily through the air, shaken loose by the tremors, drifting down onto the new landscape carved by destruction. The trail, the only road out, was gone. Buried under an avalanche of shattered stone, broken trees, and mountains of debris. It would take months, maybe longer, before anyone could clear it. And if the bear hadn't stopped him, he wouldn't have lived to see it. Daniel forced himself to his feet, boots crunching over the icy planks of the porch. His legs trembled with adrenaline and exhaustion, but he crossed to the edge of the steps and stared out into the wilderness. There was no sign of the bears now. The cinnamon-colored mother and her two cubs had vanished, swallowed by the ancient trees and the drifting snow. Gone, like ghosts, as if they had never been there at all. Only the tracks in the fresh powder proved otherwise, wide paw prints leading away from the trail, veering safely into the deeper forest where the collapse couldn't touch them. And where, by extension, they had led him. He knelt in the snow, his breath misting heavily, and pressed one hand to the ground over those tracks. The chill bit deep into his fingers, but he didn't pull away. In that moment, Daniel felt a connection deeper than words, deeper than species or fear or even gratitude. A bond that had been forged in the heart of the storm, tempered by survival, and sealed in trust. The wild had taken so much from him over the years, his comfort, his safety, even his belief in second chances. But today, it had given him something back. A reminder that even here, at the edge of the world, compassion still mattered. That sometimes, the risks you take out of kindness find their way back to you when you least expect it. He rose slowly, brushing the snow from his knees. The sky above was finally clearing, streaks of sharp blue cutting through the heavy cloud cover. The sun broke through, pale and cold, but fierce enough to send diamonds glittering across the fresh snow. Daniel looked out toward the endless trees, feeling smaller than he ever had, and somehow larger, too. Not alone. Not really. The mother bear had made her choice. And so had he. Both had risked everything for the lives of others. Neither had demanded repayment. Neither had spoken a word. And yet between them, a promise had been made and kept in full. Tomorrow, he would start planning. finding a way to survive the coming months with the trail cut off. Rationing supplies, conserving fuel, perhaps signaling for help when the weather allowed it. But today he would simply stand, and breathe, and remember. Because today, against all odds, he was alive. Thanks to a wild creature he should have feared, and instead, had chosen to trust. Miracles in the wild, the gift of gratitude. The days that followed were a quiet battle for Daniel Brooks. Without the road, without the ability to travel, his world shrank even smaller than before. He spent the hours digging out pathways around the cabin, conserving wood, rationing food with military precision. The cold remained brutal, sinking into every crack and seam, but Daniel had learned long ago how to fight it. This time, though, something inside him had shifted. Each morning, he found himself stepping out onto the porch, scanning the endless white landscape beyond the trees. Not looking for a rescue party. Not looking for a way out. Looking for a flash of cinnamon fur against the snow. He never saw her again. But somehow, he didn't need to. The memory of her final look, steady, calm, almost knowing, stayed with him, sharper than any photograph he had ever taken. It wasn't about seeing her again. It was about carrying the experience forward, letting it change the way he faced each new day. Daniel found himself talking aloud more often, as if the mother bear still listened from the woods. "You got your babies through," he would say, tossing another log on the fire. "You did good." Some nights, when the stars burned cold and bright above the mountains, he would imagine her and her cubs weaving through the trees, stronger now, hunting, thriving. In those quiet moments, Daniel realized that saving the bear family hadn't just rescued them. It had rescued him, too. It had pulled him out of the deep freeze of his own grief, cracked the ice he had wrapped around his heart since Allison's death. He hadn't even realized how numb he had become, how hollow, until the night he risked everything for creatures who could not ask for help, who could offer nothing in return. But they had offered something. Something profound. A second chance at feeling connected to the world again. At remembering that even the smallest act of compassion could echo back in ways you might never fully understand. The winter dragged on, long and merciless, but Daniel endured. When the spring finally came, soft and slow, as if afraid to disturb the snow's hold, he emerged from his cabin with a heart steadier than it had been in years. He would rebuild the trail. He would restock the cabin. He would live. Not just survive, live. And every time he caught a glimpse of movement in the woods, a fox, a moose, even just a raven winging overhead, he would wonder, quietly, if somewhere out there, a mother bear and her nearly grown cubs remembered him, too. In the wild heart of Alaska, it was impossible to know for sure. But sometimes, he thought, some bonds didn't need to be seen to endure. They were written in the snow. Etched into the wind. Carried forever in the beating of a heart that, against all odds, had chosen hope over fear. 6 months later, on a rare warm August afternoon, Daniel found himself behind the wheel of his old, battered Ford pickup, the truck rattling noisily over the rough mountain road. It had been his first trip to town since the winter, a necessary journey to restock supplies, replace the cracked generator battery, and check in with the outside world, even if only briefly. He still preferred the wild, the silence, but the isolation no longer weighed on him the way it once had. There was a new steadiness in his step, a clearer light in his hazel eyes. Living through the winter had done more than test his survival skills, it had reforged something inside him. The bed of the truck was loaded with sacks of flour, dried beans, fresh tools, and a new radio. The simple, comforting necessities of a life rebuilt. As he rounded a bend on the narrow mountain pass, Daniel slowed instinctively. The late summer sun poured over the landscape, making the peaks and valleys shimmer with a golden vibrancy that felt almost unreal after so many months of white silence. That's when he saw her. A massive bear stepped into the middle of the road, her fur glinting red gold in the sunlight. Daniel slammed the brakes hard, the tires skidding over gravel and packed earth, bringing the truck to a shuddering halt just yards away. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. For one heartbeat, two heartbeats, he could only stare. It was her. The mother bear. He knew it in an instant. She stood tall and still, her massive shoulders squared, her dark eyes fixed calmly on him. No fear. No threat. Just presence. Behind her, two young bears appeared from the brush, the cubs. Grown now, strong and healthy, their thick coats shining in the late afternoon light. Daniel's throat closed with emotion. The bear did not move toward him. She simply stood her ground, powerful and serene, as if acknowledging something unsaid between them. Then, slowly, she turned her great head, looking up the road ahead. Daniel followed her gaze, and froze. A jagged crack split the cliff wall just beyond the bend. Rocks, loosened by the spring melt and the summer heat, teetered dangerously over the roadway, ready to fall with the slightest vibration. Had he continued driving even a few seconds longer, he would have been caught under it. He turned back to the bear, heart pounding. She had stopped him again. Saved him again. Just as he had once saved her. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the distance. Not as man and beast, but as something else entirely, survivors, bound by a trust that transcended understanding. Then, with a grunt so soft it barely carried across the space between them, the mother bear turned and disappeared into the trees, her grown cubs following close behind. Daniel sat behind the wheel, staring after them long after they had vanished. The road ahead would need clearing, repairs. The journey home would be longer, harder. But he smiled anyway. Because deep down, he understood something he hadn't before. Kindness, given freely, had a way of circling back. Not always immediately. Not always in ways you expected. But when you least deserved it, or most needed it, it returned, stronger and deeper than before. In the wild heart of Alaska, where life balanced on a knife's edge every day, Daniel Brooks had found something rarer than gold. A reminder that no matter how harsh the world might seem, compassion could still carve its way through the ice. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, it would find its way back to you, in the form of a life you saved. And the one that saved you right back. In the frozen silence of Alaska, Daniel Brooks learned a truth that echoes far beyond the wilderness. Compassion is never wasted. Even the smallest act of kindness, offered without expectation, can one day return to you when you need it most. In a world that often demands we look out only for ourselves, it takes real courage to risk helping another, whether they walk on 2 legs or 4. At Paw Prints and Stories, we believe these connections between humans and animals aren't just heartwarming tales, they are powerful reminders of what it means to be truly alive. If this story touched you, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Paw Prints and Stories, where every story leaves a mark. And before you go, ask yourself. When the next storm comes, will you choose fear, or will you choose compassion?